So finally, with everything going on in the past few decades, things are finally looking up for queer people. Stonewall happens and the gay liberation movement begins. Gays are everywhere. We're in the streets in the West Village of New York. We're in San Francisco. Things couldn't be better. And now with the 80s on the horizon, what could possibly go wrong? I mean,
a mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine.
Just because my friends and I are gay, if we are affected by this disease, that no one really cares, that it seems that we deserved it, so let us die.
I lost my best friend. Did you? 4 years ago. He died of pneumocystis pneumonia. And I watched him die. I watched him just right in front of me,
It's God's way of saying to the homosexuals, stop homosexuality. At that, because it's not right, and if you do it, you're gonna die by getting AIDS.
One out of every 2 gay men in the city is estimated now to be infected with the AIDS virus.
Of 70,000 men?
35,000 are probably infected.
In the early 1980s, a handful of gay men became sick with pneumocystis pneumonia, an infection that only affects those with a compromised immune system. Soon after, gay men began to exhibit signs of Kaposi's sarcoma, a rare skin cancer that previously affected older people with compromised immune systems. Kaposi's sarcoma presents itself as reddish-purple lesions that cover the body. That is what the stones on this dress represent. All of these men were previously healthy. Most of these men died. As more and more gay men began to exhibit signs of this new disease, it was termed the gay plague, the gay cancer, and GRID, which stood for gay-related immune deficiency. Disease specialists and healthcare workers were puzzled by this new disease. It was something that they had never really seen before. We know today that this disease was HIV/AIDS. HIV attacks the body's T cells, which fight off infection and disease. After a certain percentage of these immune cells are destroyed, the body has no way of fighting off any invading infection. This final stage of HIV is called the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. In the 1980s, the term AIDS wasn't widely used at first because of this idea that the disease only affected gay men. It wasn't until this disease showed itself in other communities that the term AIDS was used more widely. There were still 4 groups of people that the disease seemed to affect more than others. These were the 4 H's. This is why I have 4 H's spelled out on my bodice with safety pins. The first H stood for homosexuals, who spread the disease through unprotected sex. The second H was for hemophiliacs, who required frequent blood transfusions when there was no way to test the blood for this disease. The third H was for heroin drug users, who shared needles, thereby passing the disease along to each other. The fourth H stood for Haitian immigrants, who many believed brought the disease over when they came to America. As this disease began to spread through communities other than just the gay community, there was a great panic, because so little was known about just how and why and when and where this disease was spread. This panic also led to lots of hatred, homophobia, and racism against the groups that were most affected. And to make matters worse, there were 0 legal protections for people living with HIV/AIDS. More often than not, a positive diagnosis was quickly followed by unemployment and homelessness. Since it was the Reagan era, the governing style of the time was very conservative and based on religion. Because AIDS mainly affected gay men in America, the Reagan administration practically ignored it. Well, except for Press Secretary Larry Speake's jokes and jabs at the expense of dying gay Americans. Though the first cases of AIDS were recorded in 1981, Reagan didn't utter the word AIDS until 1985 when answering a reporter's question. At that point, 12,000 Americans had died from AIDS-related issues. It wasn't until 1987 that Reagan made his first public speech regarding the AIDS crisis. By that point, 23,000 Americans had died of AIDS-related issues. Fueled by frustrations over a lack of action, activist groups such as the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP for short, began to organize marches and more defiant forms of protest. As more and more people began to die from AIDS, disease specialists began to piece together information that would help them combat the progression and spread of the disease. They did this through education and experimental trials of antiretroviral medications. Though most of these trials ended in failure, each one brought them closer and closer to their end goal. Through these continued efforts, there exists today daily antiretroviral medications that combat the progression and spread of HIV/AIDS. Some of these medications, like PrEP, when taken daily, can reduce your risk of contracting HIV in the first place. Making a drag outfit that reflected the AIDS crisis was a multi-step process. I began by making a beautiful 1980s gown out of hospital curtains. This gown was beautiful and reflected some of the fashion trends that were popular in the 1980s. I then stood in a room with photos from the AIDS crisis projected onto me for almost 2 hours and invited people to come in and destroy the dress while it was on me. I stood there alone while they cut, ripped, painted, and all but destroyed the dress while it was on me. This not only reflected the detrimental effects that AIDS has on the human body, but it represented society's complacency and their role in letting this disease spread so quickly and kill so many. Afterwards, I pieced the dress together using safety pins. Not only does this represent the goth fashion trends of the 1980s, but it represents a community that found strength, beauty, and togetherness on the other side of hardship. Which brings us to today. The AIDS epidemic of the 1980s seems so far away here in America, but the AIDS crisis is a global phenomenon, and it affects places that don't have the resources that we have here. Upwards of 680,000 people died from AIDS-related illnesses in 2020 alone, bringing the total number of deaths to 36.6 million since the epidemic began. So I invite you to do your part. Know your status, take your PrEP, practice safer sex practices, and be kind to one another.